The heavy, humid air of 1972 hung over the derelict farmhouse in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, like a funeral shroud. When Sheriff Miller kicked in the door, he didn't find a decomposing mess or the chaotic gore of a crime scene. Instead, he found a masterpiece. In the center of the parlor, under the dim amber glow of a kerosene lamp that was still flickering, sat two figures. They were positioned at a mahogany table, frozen in a perpetual Sunday brunch. The woman held a porcelain teacup an inch from her painted lips. The man was mid-gesture, reading a newspaper from 1958. It took the deputies 3 minutes of shouting before they realized the skin of the hosts was not pale, but cured. Their eyes were replaced with high-quality glass spheres that reflected the flashlight beams with terrifying intelligence. This was not a murder, it was a gallery. This was the final echo of Cassius and Elodia Thorne. The story of the Thornes did not begin with such elaborate stillness. It began 14 years earlier, in the sweltering, dust-choked summer of 1958. Cassius Thorne, a man of Greek and French descent, with olive skin and fingers that smelled permanently of formaldehyde and cedarwood, was a master of a dying art. He didn't just stuff animals, he captured their soul's peak. He was a man of quiet, rhythmic movements, possessing a face that was handsome yet utterly forgettable. His wife, Elodia, was his antithesis. A former bit-part actress from a traveling theater troupe in New Orleans, she had hair the color of midnight and a voice that dripped like poisoned honey. She had failed on the stage because she was too cold, the directors said. She didn't act emotion, she mimicked it. They lived in a nomadic rhythm, driving a modified 1954 Chevrolet Advanced Design van across the veins of the American Midwest. To the world, they were the Thorne Restorations, a pious, hardworking couple who traveled to small towns to repair church pews and preserve hunting trophies. In reality, they were scouting for the mundane. They looked for people who lived lives of quiet, repetitive insignificance. People whose disappearance wouldn't trigger a national manhunt, but whose essence could be elevated into something eternal. Cassius provided the technical precision, the chemicals, and the structural integrity. Elodia provided the vision, the costumes, and the psychological stagecraft. They believed they were saving their victims from the indignity of aging and the chaos of a messy death. They were giving them a permanent, beautiful role to play in a world that would have otherwise forgotten them. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that first evening in Oklahoma, Cassius looked at Elodia across the front seat of their van. "The light here is perfect," he whispered. Elodia didn't smile. She simply adjusted her gloves and stared at a small, isolated house on the edge of the plains. "Then let us begin the collection, Cassius. The stage is far too empty." The heavy, humid air of 1972 hung over the derelict farmhouse in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, like a funeral shroud. When Sheriff Miller kicked in the door, he didn't find a decomposing mess or the chaotic gore of a crime scene. Instead, he found a masterpiece. In the center of the parlor, under the dim amber glow of a kerosene lamp that was still flickering, sat two figures. They were positioned at a mahogany table, frozen in a perpetual Sunday brunch. The woman held a porcelain teacup an inch from her painted lips. The man was mid-gesture, reading a newspaper from 1958. It took the deputies 3 minutes of shouting before they realized the skin of the hosts was not pale, but cured. Their eyes were replaced with high-quality glass spheres that reflected the flashlight beams with terrifying intelligence. This was not a murder, it was a gallery. This was the final echo of Cassius and Elodia Thorne. The story of the Thornes did not begin with such elaborate stillness. It began 14 years earlier, in the sweltering, dust-choked summer of 1958. Cassius Thorne, a man of Greek and French descent with olive skin and fingers that smelled permanently of formaldehyde and cedarwood, was a master of a dying art. He didn't just stuff animals, he captured their soul's peak. He was a man of quiet, rhythmic movements, possessing a face that was handsome, yet utterly forgettable. His wife, Elodia, was his antithesis. A former bit-part actress from a traveling theater troupe in New Orleans, she had hair the color of midnight and a voice that dripped like poisoned honey. She had failed on the stage because she was too cold, the directors said. She didn't act emotion. She mimicked it. They lived in a nomadic rhythm, driving a modified 1954 Chevrolet Advanced Design van across the veins of the American Midwest. To the world, they were the Thorne Restorations, a pious, hardworking couple who traveled to small towns to repair church pews and preserve hunting trophies. In reality, they were scouting for the mundane. They looked for people who lived lives of quiet, repetitive insignificance, people whose disappearance wouldn't trigger a national manhunt, but whose essence could be elevated into something eternal. Cassius provided the technical precision, the chemicals, and the structural integrity. Elodia provided the vision, the costumes, and the psychological stagecraft. They believed they were saving their victims from the indignity of aging and the chaos of a messy death. They were giving them a permanent, beautiful role to play in a world that would have otherwise forgotten them. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that first evening in Oklahoma, Cassius looked at Elodia across the front seat of their van. "The light here is perfect," he whispered. Elodia didn't smile. She simply adjusted her gloves and stared at a small, isolated house on the edge of the plains. "Then let us begin the collection, Cassius. The stage is far too empty." By 1961, the Thornes had refined their methodology into a chillingly efficient ritual. They arrived in Salina, Kansas, during a season of oppressive heat and golden wheat fields. Their target was Martha Green, a 22-year-old waitress at a local transit hub who lived alone in a small clapboard house on the outskirts of town. Martha was the quintessential background character of the American dream, pretty but tired, always serving, never served. Elodia watched her for 3 days, noting the exact way she sat in her rocking chair on the porch every evening at 6:45 p.m., clutching a worn copy of a romance novel. To Elodia, Martha was a perfect canvas, a woman whose life was a series of loops that deserved to be stopped at their most tranquil point. On a Tuesday night, under the cover of a passing thunderstorm that muffled all sound, the Thornes struck. Cassius entered through the back, using a rag soaked in a specialized anesthetic he'd concocted from veterinary supplies and ether. Within seconds, Martha was unconscious. There was no struggle, no bruised flesh to mar the sculpture. They moved her to her own kitchen table. For the next 12 hours, the small house became a laboratory. Cassius worked with a feverish, silent intensity, making small, invisible incisions behind the ears and under the armpits to begin the preservation process. He used a series of pumps hidden in his medical bag to replace her blood with a heavy, wax-based compound that would prevent the skin from collapsing or discoloring. Meanwhile, Elodia acted as the set designer. She laundered Martha's favorite floral dress, pressed it until the pleats were sharp enough to cut, and applied a layer of theatrical makeup that gave the girl a permanent, healthy glow. They didn't just leave her there, they built a scene. They set the table for a solo dinner, a bowl of wax fruit, a polished spoon, and a glass of water that Cassius sealed with a thin layer of clear resin to prevent evaporation. They posed Martha with her chin resting on her hand, looking wistfully out the window toward the horizon. When they were finished, the house looked entirely normal from the street. It wasn't until a week later, when the mailman noticed Martha hadn't moved from her chair for several days, that the horror was discovered. The police were baffled. There were no signs of a break-in, no struggle, and, most confusingly, the body showed no typical signs of decomposition. The local coroner had never seen anything like it. It was as if Martha Green had simply turned into a doll. The town was paralyzed by a quiet, vibrating fear. people began locking their doors, but they didn't know what they were locking out. The Thornes were already 300 miles away, crossing the border into Iowa. In the back of the van, Cassius was cleaning his scalpels with meticulous care. "She was a bit too thin," he commented, his voice flat. "The wax didn't settle quite right in the cheeks." Elodia looked at her husband, her eyes reflecting the passing telephone poles. "She was a start, Cassius, but the next one needs to be more complex. We need a scene with more than one actor." In the winter of 1964, the Thornes pulled into Oskaloosa, Iowa, a town draped in heavy snow and the suffocating silence of Midwestern piety. Their target was Mr. Abraham Vance, a 70-year-old widower and retired pharmacist who lived in a grand Victorian-style house filled with mahogany clocks and fading memories. Abraham was a man of rigid habits, spending his afternoons in his study, meticulously organizing his collection of antique stamps. To the Thornes, he represented the tragedy of stagnant history, a man who had become a ghost before he had even died. They decided that Abraham shouldn't be alone in his final presentation. He needed a companion to complete the domestic tragedy. The opportunity arose when a local seamstress, a middle-aged woman named Beatrice with no living relatives, went to Abraham's house to deliver repaired curtains. The Thornes had been waiting. Cassius neutralized them both with the precision of a clockmaker, using a pressurized dart system he had engineered to avoid any physical marks of violence. Inside the Victorian mansion, the temperature was lowered to preserve the materials while they worked. This time, the process was even more invasive. Cassius utilized a new technique, inserting internal steel armatures through the soles of their feet to allow the bodies to stand unsupported by furniture. It was a grueling 36-hour marathon of chemistry and structural engineering. Elodia took charge of the narrative. She didn't want a simple dinner scene. She wanted a theatrical confrontation. She posed Abraham standing by the fireplace, one hand outstretched as if offering a glass of sherry, while Beatrice was positioned near the door, mid-turn, her coat half on, as if she were caught in a moment of eternal departure. The attention to detail was pathological. Elodia even used a fine needle to thread individual eyelashes into place where the originals had thinned. When they were done, the study looked like a high-end wax museum, yet the skin felt eerily like cold, supple leather. The discovery 3 weeks later sent shockwaves through the state. The local police, led by a confused and terrified sheriff, found the house perfectly heated and the actors perfectly poised. The most disturbing element was the lack of a motive. Nothing had been stolen, and no sexual assault had occurred. The victims were simply preserved. The Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation was called in, but the forensic science of 1964 was ill-equipped to handle such sophisticated chemical preservation. They began to suspect a mad scientist or a cult, but the Thornes were already gone, their van blending into the sea of travelers on the newly built interstate highways. In the quiet of their cabin, Elodia began sketching their next project. She was growing restless with the stillness of their work. She wanted to see if they could capture a moment of action, something more violent and visceral. Cassius watched her, noting for the first time a flicker of erratic hunger in her eyes that made even him feel a chill. The year 1967 brought a jagged edge to the Thornes' marriage. As the rest of the country dissolved into the psychedelic chaos of the summer of love, Cassius and Elodia retreated into a cold internal war. They were parked in a secluded campsite near Lincoln, Nebraska. Cassius remained a purist, obsessed with the sanctity of the preservation, but Elodia's appetite had morphed. She no longer wanted to capture tranquility. She wanted to capture the frantic pulse of fear. The rift widened when they targeted a young hitchhiker named Julian, a boy with long hair and a guitar who smelled of patchouli and rebellion. He was the antithesis of their orderly world. Against Cassius's protests for a clean, chemical immobilization, Elodia insisted on a live study. She wanted to see the transition of the eyes from life to glass in real time. While Cassius prepared the injections in the back of the van, Elodia toyed with the boy, using a small paring knife to create shallow rhythmic nicks on his forearms, watching the blood bead like rubies. "You're ruining the canvas, Elodia," Cassius hissed, his hands trembling for the first time in a decade. "The skin must be pristine. This is science, not butchery." Elodia laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and leaned over the terrified boy. "It's theater, Cassius, and every great play needs a bit of tragedy." The eventual murder was messy, a frantic struggle that left bruises on Julian's neck that even Cassius's heavy-duty cosmetics struggled to hide. They spent 4 days trying to fix the damage in a rented garage. They eventually posed the boy in a meditative state, cross-legged in a field of sunflowers, but the structural integrity was compromised. The armatures didn't hold, and the body slumped slightly to the left, a flaw that haunted Cassius like a physical wound. For the first time, they left a trace. A single black theatrical glove belonging to Elodia, dropped in the tall grass. This murder broke their rhythm. Cassius began to see his wife not as a partner, but as a contaminant to his work. Elodia saw her husband as a boring technician who lacked the courage to embrace the true darkness of their calling. The silence between them in the van was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of a secret each was starting to keep from the other. They were no longer two halves of a whole. They were two predators competing for the same soul. As they drove toward the Wyoming border, the radio played songs of revolution, and inside the Chevrolet, a private revolution was brewing. Cassius watched Elodia in the rearview mirror, wondering if her skin would be as easy to cure as the others, while Elodia sharpened her knife, dreaming of a scene where the taxidermist became the exhibit. The unity that had kept them invisible for nearly a decade was beginning to fray at the seams, and the world was finally starting to look for the monsters in the van. By 1970, the Thornes had reached a state of terminal escalation. They drifted into Casper, Wyoming, a town of rugged men and sharp winds where the isolation of the landscape mirrored the desolation of their marriage. Their target was Sarah Thorne, no relation, but the coincidence of the name felt like an omen to Elodia. Sarah was the 19-year-old daughter of the local deputy sheriff, a girl who radiated the kind of vibrant, youthful energy that Elodia now found intolerable. The plan was their most ambitious yet. They wouldn't just preserve a body, they would replace a life. On a moonless October night, they abducted Sarah from her bedroom, leaving no sign of a struggle, only a faint scent of almond and ozone. In a rented, insulated warehouse on the outskirts of town, the theater began. Elodia demanded that Sarah be preserved in a state of perpetual flight. Her body arched, one foot barely touching the ground, as if she were dancing or running from an invisible shadow. Cassius, driven by a desperate need to reclaim his dominance through technical perfection, spent 72 hours straight working on the internal skeletal structure. He used aircraft-grade aluminum wires to support the weight, and a new experimental polymer that allowed the skin to retain a translucent, lifelike glow. He worked with a surgeon's detachment, ignoring Elodia's constant mocking critiques. However, the pressure of the girl's high-profile disappearance was mounting. The deputy sheriff had organized a massive search party, and the town was crawling with law enforcement. For the first time, the Thornes felt the heat. To finish the work, they had to move Sarah's partially preserved body back into the van and drive through a police checkpoint. It was a moment of agonizing tension. The deputy himself peered into the back of the van, his flashlight beam missing Sarah's glass-eyed face by mere inches, hidden behind a false partition of church organ pipes. They managed to place the sculpture in a public park, positioned under a weeping willow tree just as the sun began to rise. When the search party found her an hour later, the deputy collapsed. It wasn't the sight of death that broke him, but the sight of his daughter appearing to live, frozen in a grace she never possessed in life. The ghost of Casper became a national headline. The sheer audacity of the crime, leaving the victim in the middle of a manhunt, marked the end of their era of invisibility. Cassius felt a grim pride in the perfection of the form, but Elodia was already looking back, her eyes fixed on the deputy's grief. "Did you see his face, Cassius?" she whispered, as they fled toward Nebraska. "That was the real art. The body is just the frame." Cassius didn't answer. He was looking at the chemical stains on his hands, realizing that his masterpieces were now being hunted not for their beauty, but for the rot they concealed. The final movement of their symphony had begun, and the audience was finally catching up. The 1970s brought a shift in the air, a transition from the disorganized local policing of the past to a more analytical, cross-state approach. Enter Silas Vance, a young, sharp-eyed investigator with the Nebraska State Patrol who possessed a mind for patterns. Silas wasn't interested in the why of murder as much as the how. While others saw the ghost of Casper and the stiff waitress of Kansas as isolated, freakish incidents, Silas spent his nights in a dimly lit office surrounded by black and white crime scene photos. He noticed a recurring chemical signature mentioned in the autopsy reports, a rare combination of Greek-imported resins and high-grade industrial arsenic that wasn't available in standard mortuaries. He began to map the occurrences, tracing a slow, serpentine path that cut through the heart of the Midwest over a decade. Silas possessed a theory that his superiors mocked. He believed they weren't looking for a killer, but a traveling artisan. He spent months visiting taxidermy shops and chemical suppliers, eventually finding a lead at a boutique warehouse in New Orleans. An old ledger showed a consistent recurring order for Thornes restorations, paid in cash and shipped to various general delivery addresses across the plains. Silas realized he was looking for a ghost who moved in a van, a man who treated human flesh like antique wood. His break came when he revisited the scene in Casper. Sifting through the grass where Sarah had been posed, he found a tiny crystalline fragment. It wasn't bone, it was a high-end glass eye, the kind used for museum-grade predatory birds, but custom-painted with a human iris. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of manufacture. Silas began to alert every border patrol and small-town sheriff from Wyoming to Oklahoma, describing a 1954 Chevrolet van and a couple that appeared too perfect. He knew that for someone like Cassius, the need for supplies was their only tether to the real world. Silas wasn't just following a trail of bodies anymore. He was following a trail of specialized chemicals and artificial eyes. He felt the weight of the years the Thornes had stolen, and he became obsessed with the man who could look at a human being and see a doll. As Silas drove toward the Nebraska-Oklahoma border, he felt a cold certainty. The Thornes were getting bolder, their work more public, and their mistakes more frequent. The hunter was no longer just behind them. He was beginning to predict their next stop. The era of the silent American landscape was coming to a violent, screeching halt. By the autumn of 1972, the air between Cassius and Elodia was thick with the scent of ozone and unspoken threats. They had retreated to a dilapidated farmhouse in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, intended to be their final sanctuary and their grandest studio. However, Elodia's mental stability was crumbling into a jagged mosaic of narcissism and recklessness, while Cassius was obsessed with the structural perfection of their Okmulgee Brunch installation, the two victims they had meticulously prepared to sit at the parlor table. Elodia had begun to keep a secret record. She was a frustrated actress who finally had a captive audience, and she documented every performance in a leather-bound ledger. She didn't just write, She sketched the anatomical dissections and the precise placement of the armatures, often adding mocking poems about the victim's final moments. The error occurred on a rain-drenched Tuesday when they were forced to stop at a roadside service station to repair a leaking radiator on the Chevrolet. While Cassius was under the hood, Elodia went inside to buy cigarettes. In her haste to hide her ledger from a suspicious clerk who glanced at her blood-stained cuff, she dropped a small folded charcoal sketch, a detailed drawing of Sarah Thorne's internal wire structure, signed with a flourishing E. The clerk, a veteran with an eye for the macabre, didn't call out. He waited until they drove away and then picked up the paper. The image was so clinically horrific that he immediately contacted the local authorities, who in turn reached Silas Vance. Silas, already in the region, recognized the E from a theater program he'd unearthed in New Orleans during his investigation. He knew he was within 20 miles of the architects. Back at the farmhouse, the Thornes were unaware of the closing circle. Elodia was becoming increasingly erratic, dancing through the rooms filled with their silent guests, talking to them as if they were her cast members. Cassius watched her with a cold, calculated distance. He realized that Elodia was no longer his partner. She was a liability that threatened his legacy. He began to prepare a new batch of preservatives, but this time, the volume was enough for a body of her exact height and weight. He planned to make her his final silent masterpiece, the actress who finally learned to keep her mouth shut. The tension inside the house was a mirror of the storm outside, both waiting for the lightning to strike. Silas Vance, guided by the clerk's description of the van, was now systematically checking every abandoned property on the county line. The invisible couple had finally left a physical piece of their soul behind, and it was the only invitation the law needed to crash their final curtain call. The end arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the crunch of gravel under Silas Vance's tires. On a humid October evening, 3 police cruisers and Silas's unmarked sedan crept up the long, weed-choked driveway of the Okmulgee farmhouse. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying sweetness of glycerin and the sharp sting of vinegar. Cassius was in the cellar, his back turned as he adjusted the tension on a wire protruding from Elodia's shoulder. He had drugged her evening tea, intending to begin her transformation while she still possessed a faint glow of life. When the first megaphone blast shattered the silence, demanding they come out with hands raised, Cassius didn't panic. He felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was too heavy to carry alone any longer. He looked at Elodia, slumped in a chair, her eyes fluttering open, clouded and confused. "The critics are here, my love," he whispered, stroking her cheek with a latex-gloved hand. Silas Vance led the breach, his service weapon trembling slightly. As the front door gave way, the officers were met with the Okmulgee Brunch. For a moment, the lead deputy lowered his gun, his brain refusing to process that the 2 elderly people smiling at the table were hollowed-out shells. The house was a labyrinth of horrors. In the kitchen, a maid stood frozen mid-sweep. In the hallway, a child played with wooden blocks that were glued to the floor. Silas pushed past the macabre statues, following the smell of chemicals to the cellar. He found Cassius standing over Elodia, a long, thin needle in his hand, looking like a priest at a dark altar. "Don't move, Thorne," Silas barked, his voice echoing in the stone room. Cassius turned slowly, a faint, polite smile on his face. "You're late, detective. The gallery is almost finished." The subsequent search of the property lasted 4 days. They found the archives beneath the floorboards, trunks filled with the clothing, teeth, and wedding rings of over 20 victims dating back to the late 50s. The most damning evidence was the ledger Elodia had dropped, a complete roadmap of their atrocities, including the chemical formulas and the locations of the outdoor installations they had left across 5 states. As the forensic teams carried out the frozen victims, many of whom looked more alive than the living, The sheer scale of the Thornes' depravity began to sink in. They hadn't just killed. They had sought to replace reality with a static, morbid imitation. Elodia, still groggy from the sedatives, hissed at the officers, cursing them for ruining the set, while Cassius remained eerily silent, watching the technicians handle his work with a look of profound professional disappointment. The Thorne collection was finally closed, and the world outside was about to learn the true meaning of a still life. The trial of Cassius and Elodia Thorne in 1973 was a media circus that gripped a nation already reeling from the scars of the Vietnam War. It was dubbed the Trial of the Waxworks. For the first time, the American public saw the faces of the monsters who had turned their neighbors into furniture. Elodia played her final role to the hilt, alternating between fits of hysterical laughter and catatonic stares, claiming she was merely an artistic consultant. Cassius, however, remained a chilling pillar of stoic arrogance. He sat in the defendant's chair with a straight back, occasionally correcting the prosecution's medical experts on the specific chemical properties of his preservatives. When Silas Vance took the stand, he presented the glass eye found in Casper and the leather-bound ledger. The most haunting moment occurred when the prosecution displayed photos of the Okmulgee Brunch. Several jurors wept. One fainted. The evidence was an avalanche. Over 24 confirmed murders were linked to the pair through the archives found in their cellar, though Silas suspected the true number was closer to 40. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a verdict, guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The judge, a man of old-school Oklahoman iron, sentenced them both to death by the electric chair. In the months leading up to the execution, Cassius refused all visitors except for Silas. During their final meeting, Cassius leaned against the plexiglass, his hands still mimicking the motions of a craftsman. "You think you've buried us, detective," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "But my work is still out there. In parks, in abandoned houses, sitting on porches you haven't checked. I have given them immortality. What have you given them?" Silas didn't answer. He simply walked away, haunted by the thought of how many statues were still being mistaken for shadows in the twilight of small-town America. On a cold morning in 1974, the Thornes were led to the execution chamber. Elodia went first, screaming lines from a forgotten play until the current silenced her. Cassius followed an hour later, stepping toward the chair with the calm demeanor of a man entering his own workshop. He didn't offer any last words. As the switch was thrown, the lights in the prison flickered, a final stutter in the electrical heartbeat of the Midwest. After their deaths, the state attempted to cremate the remains, but the high concentration of chemicals in their tissues caused the incinerator to burn with a strange emerald-green flame that lasted for hours. Silas Vance retired shortly after, moving to a coastal town where there was nothing but shifting sand and water, elements that could never be frozen, wired, or preserved. The Thorne case was closed, but for decades after, people in the Midwest would still shiver when they saw a figure sitting too still in a window at dusk, wondering if it was a neighbor or one of Cassius's forgotten masterpieces, waiting in the silence for a breath that would never come.